When I look back at my journey and how I first wanted to go into the law, it started when I was 8 years old. And unfortunately, it started with a very tragic event in my family. So my auntie, is Dakota and also has heritage as a Black woman, was married to a man who was a Black man. And he went in to pay a speeding ticket at a sheriff's office in a county in the state of Kansas and was brutally beaten. They had to call an ambulance and take him to the hospital. They filed a civil action following that, and I remember being 8 years old and watching on television when they won that civil action. And I remember the time telling my family, "This is how you get justice. That was something that was horrible. I want to be a lawyer."
Welcome to the Mitchell Hamlin School of Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast, brought to you by the student-run and student-edited journal at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. Founded in 1976, our journal is dedicated to excellence through diligence, not exclusivity. And now we're thrilled to bring that mission to the airwaves. My name is Maggie, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal.
And I'm Ashley, the public policy editor. Today, we are kicking off Native American Heritage Month with Professor Angelique Eaglewoman. She's the professor of law at Mitchell Hamlin. She's also the director of Native American Law and Sovereignty Institute. And of course, she is the Chief Justice on the Sisseton Wahpeton Supreme Court and continues to serve as pro tempore tribal judge in several other tribal court systems. So welcome, Professor Eaglewoman. We are so excited to have you today. I have had the personal pleasure of taking Professor Eaglewoman's class, so I have gotten to hear some really incredible stories. And one of my favorites that I think you should share today for our listeners is how you became a lawyer, because I just think it's so inspiring.
Thank you for inviting me. So let me start with our traditional introduction. So my name is Professor Angelique Eaglewoman, Wambadi Awanui Chake Washtewian in my Dakota language. I'm an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation. And in the introduction you provided, I'm a law professor at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law and have the honor of directing the Native American Law and Sovereignty Institute. Thank you for inviting me today, and happy Native American Heritage Month. So I'm pleased when this month rolls around and people take an interest and maybe gain more education about Native Americans and especially Native American law. When I look back at my journey and how I first wanted to go into the law, it started when I was 8 years old. And unfortunately, it started with a very tragic event in my family. So my auntie, is Dakota and also has heritage as a Black woman, was married to a man who was a Black man. And he went in to pay a speeding ticket at a sheriff's office in a county in the state of Kansas and was brutally beaten. They had to call an ambulance and take him to the hospital. They filed a civil action following that, and I remember being 8 years old and watching on television when they won that civil action. And I remember the time telling my family, "This is how you get justice. That was something that was horrible. I want to be a lawyer." And my father then gave me books to read. I was very curious as a young person and read a lot of books. And I read books like Vine Lawyer Jr.'s, he was Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, book Custer Died for Your Sins, talking about all these different policy eras of the United States and how they had negatively impacted tribal people. And bury my heart at Wounded Knee about genocidal policies towards Native American people that really impacted our population. And so after that, I said, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer for tribes. And so from a very young age, that was my goal.
Wow, it's really inspiring to hear, the motivation and the inspiration that you are that derived from such a horrible experience. Because I feel like for a lot of people that can be very um, defeating, but for you it was motivating, which is very cool to hear. Um, As you said, November is Native American Heritage Month, and it often sparks conversations about visibility and representation. From your experience, what policy or legal issues should be centered during this month that often get overlooked?
So, and I know I've shared with you the Minnesota Native American Essential Understandings. One of the things that is an opportunity to educate, but often also an issue of visibility is how much people know about tribal nations or whether they do know anything about tribal nations. And I know that I've had mixed responses. And when I'm teaching at the graduate level. And so I'm hoping that people have had some introduction to tribal governments, tribal sovereignty, tribal issues. And often people do not. And they take classes, which I'm very thankful they take, to learn just even the most basics about the law of tribes and that tribes exist as governments. Tribal nations predated the United States. And the United States, when it was being formed, was very concerned about relations with tribal nations and knew they had to have peaceful relations. And so there were over 400 treaties entered into with tribal nations that include perpetual peace and friendship. And so that's the standard that tribal nations still hold the United States government to. And that means that we're all treaty people. And so we should be educated about the treaties. And my perspective in teaching about Native American law and the United States and state governments is legal pluralism. It's okay to have different governments coexist. It brings forth better ideas. We all know that when more people are engaged in thinking about solutions, better solutions are arrived at. So we continue to exist as tribal nations, as tribal governments, and that is something that I do hope people learn more about during this month.
That's awesome. So, as I think when you think back to your experience in law school, what do you think was the most helpful for you as an Indigenous student, kind of navigating law school?
So law school was difficult for me environmentally. I did well academically, but environmentally, I was the only Native person in my class, and I felt like I spent a lot of time questioning my professors on how does tribal law fit into this, and also explaining to my classmates why I was upset at times with the way certain materials were presented or omitted. So what that left me with, when I did become later educated, it was a long time before I learned about how to become a law professor. I didn't have any mentors that showed me the way until I actually went and got my LLM. And that's when I found mentors that told me about how to become a law professor. But it then became my real motivation to make sure that people didn't have that experience, that they weren't the only one in their law school class. And for the most part, I have been successful at advocating for that, but not always.
Well, I think the nice thing is Mitchell Hamlin. I think for me, I really appreciate how many resources there are at Mitchell Hamlin for Indigenous students, and I think there's quite a few resources. And so I hope for our Indigenous listeners, I hope you join NALSA, and I hope you continue to push to find community in places where there isn't, because I think it's definitely needed in a lot of places, and you have to continue pushing for it.
So let me add a footnote there and say, while I continue to advocate and would like to see more Native students, we do have the largest population of Native American students at any law school in the country. So at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, reporting from fall 2025, we currently have 42 Native American law students. Of those, 37 are tribally enrolled, and 2 are First Nation students, and 3 are first generation descendants. So that's more than any other law school can say by far in throughout the United States.
Wow. I think hearing that, I always think that's such an uplifting note to hear, you know? I love hearing that we're getting more of those students. We're, reaching out and getting more. So that's exciting.
Yeah. For our listeners who aren't familiar, could you give us a short breakdown of Native American law? I think for many, we're told that, like, oh, you don't really have to worry about that area of law. It's not jurisdictionally relevant, which is something that I really fight against because it is just so critically important area to understand, especially for those of us that live in areas where there are a lot of reservations.
Sure. I don't know, I can break down the entire field. I can tell you a little bit about the framework. So I have a recent case book that just came out on Native American law, and then I'm co-author of a supplement mastering Native American law. So there are resources out there, and there are about, I want to say about 16 Native law programs in the almost 200 law schools across the United States. So still not that many. In the last estimate I saw about 30 tribally enrolled faculty members out of about 9,000. So very small and very much the people in the field, there's a lot to write and get the word out. So I appreciate the question and the opportunity to talk about this. But Native American law is really the interaction between tribal nations and the United States government. And like I said early on, the United States knew that having positive relations with tribes was really important. And so we start with a treaty relationship framework. And we also have the United States setting itself up as the trustee for Native Americans, both governments and individuals. And so from the tribal side, we often talk about the federal treaty and trust relationship. And from the treaties, those are ratified by the US Senate and they are still legally binding today. And so one of the things that people may come in contact with at some point is the idea of off-reservation reserved treaty rights. So many of the tribal leaders had a great foresight and said, okay, if we're going to reserve this part of our land for our reservation as a homeland, we still need to go to that river. We still need to go to that place where we hunt. We still need to go to that place where those medicines grow. And so there's off reservation treaty hunting and fishing rights in lands that are ceded. And ceded is another word for purchased by the United States government in treaties. So that's where a lot of interaction comes from and there needs to be a collaborative relationship there. And that's really what tribal nations are about, collaborative relationships. So there's opportunities here for more collaboration with the federal government and the state government. Um, Tribes are often in a defensive stance where others are seeking to like run energy pipelines through natural resources, or even there have been times when states have questioned tribal jurisdiction to different resources. And so that's when tribal nations really would like to see the United States government stand up to those promises of perpetual peace and friendship. So that gives you kind of an overview of some of the main issues that tribal peoples look to in the law.
I think that's a good overview. What do you think most people misunderstand about tribal sovereignty?
I just think people don't know that we exist sometimes. And I've had that. I've had people say that, especially in heavily populated East Coast areas, that they have little to no understanding that tribal nations still exist. And so part of that is education, 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 and getting to a place where we have state leaders that speak about their relations with tribes, where we have federal agencies and federal lawmakers have a better understanding, and media. So in recent years, we've seen some media developed where we've seen TV shows and movies with more Native-centered narratives and stories. And I think that's helped a lot. So hopefully we continue to see that. And Native people are everywhere and engaged in lots of different things. And so we continue to want people to engage. And in the field of Native law, I will say too, not only do we want Native students, we want allies because we want people to understand and go out in their legal careers and be able to talk about the basics of the relationship and educate other people in their workforce.
It always shocks me how, like, you would think for, even as kids, like, growing up and you're going through your history classes, you would think that big part of our history where we signed all these treaties, like, you would think that this is, like, a critical era where we should be educating people on, like, it's amazes me that so many people just don't get that kind of education, just even the basics. So
I do wanna plug a video that's on YouTube. It's called More Than Bows and Arrows, and it's a little dated. It was made in, I think, the late 1970s, but it gives some really good information in, like, the different types of housing tribal people have made, urban areas that existed before the United States was formed, intellectual property, intellectual development, restorative justice. A lot of people, have given credit to tribes for that, and some people have not, but that whole field has been heavily influenced by dispute resolution processes from tribal nations.
I actually I've seen Bows and Arrows and I loved it. I grew up watching some of those old documentaries and I think they can be so educational. So we will definitely link that for our listeners.
Speaking of education, there's recently been an ongoing effort to create materials and resources for educators on tribal nations in Minnesota. And in 2004, Stand Native Minnesota came out with essential understandings, and it emphasizes that tribes are sovereign nations and that Native people are integral to Minnesota's past and present. How do you see this kind of educator guidance influencing public understanding of tribal sovereignty over the long term?
I think it's wonderful. When we have things like this, and it's only seven essential understandings, and it's a guide to help public educators with social studies curriculum. And a few months ago, I was on a webinar with over 100 social studies teachers in the St. Paul district, grades 6 through 12, giving just a basic overview of tribal government relations with the United States. If young people are taught this and grow up with this, it makes it so much richer and more meaningful as they continue on with their education, and they can add more knowledge on top of that foundation. Whereas a lot of times we're starting with, here's the foundation, and people almost feel a sense of betrayal that they didn't know this or weren't taught this, as um, Ashley kind of expressed. And so Minnesota has done this. We've seen pushback in South Dakota about basic social studies curriculum for the tribes that are in that state. Um, and so it's different uh, depending on what state you're in. But the National Indian Education Association has been advocating for Indigenous education for all and asking states to think about adding to their social studies curriculum something about tribal governments that is collaborative with the tribes in that state. And so that's what's wonderful about Understand Native America or Native Minnesota. Understand Native Minnesota. I'm jumping ahead and want the whole country to do it. But the 11 tribes in Minnesota collaborated on this. And so that makes it even more meaningful to know that we have a resource where the tribal nations came together.
I think that's exciting. I always hope when we encounter months like November and Native American, Heritage Month that people, especially educators, continue to push themselves to look for resources that help explain these concepts. I think it's so important that we continuously push ourselves to find good resources. I think it's tough to and I think a lot of people it's easy to just stick with what we have and what we know. And I think for education you kind of have to constantly like, you know what, there's a lot of things I don't know and this month I'm gonna do some more research. I'm gonna look into this. So
See, that's a growth mindset as a law student. I almost called you a lawyer, Ashley. That's a growth mindset as a law student. We're constantly learning. And when we become lawyers, we are required to do continuing legal education. And so our field is all about that. Continue to grow and learn.
I just always hope that other fields pick it up, and especially, like, I guess for me, I was raised with a mom who's an educator, so my mom always took learning to the next level. So, like, if we had a topic that month, we were going to every museum in the area that she could find, and so I always get excited, and I hope other people, you know, do the same. So well, I think the next question I have for you is in your experience as a judge, what can attorneys expect in a tribal court?
So when attorneys come to tribal court, first you have to be sworn in and you have to do all of the admission things. Some people think that they can stroll into tribal court without doing that, and that isn't respectful because all courts require some kind of admission. Same with tribal courts. Some tribal courts even have their own bar exam. There are a few out there where that's an admission requirement. The tribal court I preside over is the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Oyate Supreme Court, so I'm on the appellate level. But I have practiced quite a bit in tribal courts, particularly in Oklahoma. And I'm still licensed in Oklahoma, South Dakota, and DC. And so going to tribal court, you need to know a little bit about that tribe's history, and you definitely need to know the tribal law you're going to be arguing. And there's a different hierarchy in tribal courts. The hierarchy is the tribal court's own decisions as precedent. Other tribes from that region or cultural group, usually federal law and then state law. When a brief is filed and it's all state law citations, that's automatically going to clue in the tribal court judge you didn't do your homework and you're not coming in researching tribal law or understanding these systems. And so no one wants that feeling of, I made a huge mistake here. So, get educated about it. We offer a class, Introduction to Tribal Law, and we also have a tribal code drafting clinic. And so all of those are opportunities to learn more about tribal court practice.
What do you think the next generation of the tribal court systems will look like, especially given the emergence of AI? Is that going to change anything?
AI is interesting in many ways. So I'll start with some of the cons. Some of the cons are water protectors are very serious in Native American communities about the environmental risks of AI and the amount of water that is being used to cool the servers. So there's a climate impact that some people are raising an alarm about. Another challenge with AI is that it often scrapes information that's already out on the internet, and there isn't as much um, accurate information as we would like about tribal nations on the internet. And so there is the possibility of propagating misinformation. On the positive, if and this is coming up in a lot of conferences on tribal data sovereignty and information sovereignty. If tribes are able to meet the moment, and that does require resources and dedicated professionals, but if they're able to meet the moment and put out information, again, creating that information to direct AI to about tribal history, tribal law, tribal codes, tribal court opinions, those kinds of things, then that could be a tool for a more educated, not only legal profession, but all types of people having that information. So it's a moment where there needs to be a lot of resources and there are concerns about climate impact.
I think that's interesting. I'm always worried about some of the biases that AI has, and I'm always worried that the people that create AI, when they took into, with those biases that they wrote into it, did they take into account Indigenous communities? And I think oftentimes it's no. Do you think there's areas where state courts are beginning to learn from tribal courts rather than the other way around?
Sure, especially since the 1990s. there have been in different states tribal court, state court forums. And so I was previously a law professor in Idaho and had a really robust tribal court, state court forum. And it was just a wonderful experience. I often would give talks to the judges, and they all enjoyed collaborating and talking to each other. And it was very important for people, both on reservations and within the state, for things like protection orders, keeping people safe. We've had a missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis happen in the United States because of the criminal jurisdiction complexities that the U.S. Supreme Court and Congress have added in to tribal courts being able to do public safety. And so the more collaborative systems are, the more safety orders and laws can be put in place that are enforceable on tribal lands. We also see some states having deferrals. They defer criminal prosecutions to assign people to tribal healing and wellness courts when there's a substance abuse issue that may have led to criminal conduct. And some states, they only look at misdemeanors. Some states only look at juveniles. But all of that is helpful for restorative justice measures because in many tribal court systems, it's how do we deal with the whole person rather than the symptom of the behavior that's made them act out. And if we don't deal with the whole person, they're going to be repeat offenders. And so if we can address this person and bring them into community, bring social services in, bring in law enforcement, bring in cultural training, bring in their family, and talk to them and have a plan for them. And it takes resources and care about each human. Then we may be able to solve things. And so I do think that we're seeing similar things in state courts where they have drug courts and veterans courts and specific court systems. And it's this idea that each person is important and shouldn't just be a statistic. And I've been on faculties long enough that I've heard decade after decade after decade there needs to be criminal justice reform in the states and in the federal system. And it's been very slow to see anything changing there. But I do think those developments around deferrals to tribal courts or setting up specific courts that address the whole person are really a step in the right direction.
I have to say, so last week, not last week, but last month, we talked to Professor Netzel about moral injury. And I think for any attorneys listening, or, law students as well who feel like they're, practicing in a regular court does present some really tough moral things that we have to decide. I think wellness court is such a great opportunity for law students and for attorneys who want the ability to feel like they're making a change in someone's life. I think it's just such a great way of like bringing together a community and going, "Hey, we're gonna help you find help, and we're gonna put a plan together." So it's awesome, and I feel like many people kind of discount it and they don't think about it, especially as law students. We just go, "Okay, hey, I got to find some court to practice in," and so I hope people do think about it.
Professor, what
Mhm.
misconceptions do you think that non-native attorneys most often have about practicing in Indian country?
I think that people are often resistant to the unknown. And so, how do you become familiar with a court? You practice in it, you meet other members of that court's bar, and every tribal court has clerks that you can call and ask who are other members of the tribal court bar, reach out to them. It's that networking that we do as lawyers and ask them, what's this court like? What are some things, some tips you might give me? And so having a little bit of humility and being able to know that if you're going into a new system, there are things to learn. Sometimes tribal courts, especially in domestic relations matters, may have standing orders about customary law and principles that they use, um, how important it is for parental involvement or grandparents, things like that. And so, again, talking to the tribal court clerks, finding out are there standing orders on customary law, are there precedent cases, and where would I find them? Those kinds of things. The legal databases have not completely made themselves accessible to tribal courts. There's still heavy fees that go with selecting tribal court opinions and publishing them on Westlaw and LexisNexis. And so that's been an area where you have to do the research with the tribal court clerks on precedent. So it does make it a little more deliberative, and you can't just do a search on one of those databases.
That's tough. I know. I think a lot of people don't realize that it's not. We like to think of Westlaw and Lexis as this big, like, all-encompassing database that has everything, and it's crazy to me how much, like, just a significant difference in the two of them and the lacking of case law. So you play two roles, professor and judge. Are you seeing a change? Are we seeing more Native American lawyers out there? Is there anything that gives you hope?
We just had an event at the law school, and a lot of the recently graduated Native law students who are now lawyers and practicing came to the event, and it was just wonderful to see. It's the next generations here. We're seeing it in our organization. So I'm a board member of the Minnesota Native American Bar Association. The recent election, we have some newly admitted people on the board. The National Native American Bar Association, we see engagement with new lawyers. So all of that's very promising, and they're going to be the future leaders and professors. And so I do have a lot of hope. I do have a lot of hope with our program and with the other ones out across the country. We do see each other at a major conference every April, and so that's a great time to reconnect. And again, we have a space here for allies as well. And so to see people out there and making a difference and bringing their education forward is great.
That's really encouraging to hear. Um, you teach tribal code drafting, and I was wondering if you could highlight the difference between tribal code drafting and drafting like a regular statute.
Well, tribes would say theirs are regular too. So if you're talking about like state or county, and I guess federal too would be other systems. For tribes and for the clinic that I teach, we start with the codes that already exist, and we have the in-house lawyers from those tribes come in and give a presentation about here's our governance system, here's the way our legislation it moves through the process. So what we're doing is we're doing a basic draft, or the law students are really. I'm just giving them advice and suggestions, and then giving it over to the legal in-house counsel, and they may edit it somewhat, and then they're going to bring it through the process for the tribal government. But often in-house counsel are very busy, and they've got a huge to-do list. And so they're picking things at the bottom of their list and saying, here, law student. And they're very thankful when our law students bring their high quality of work to the tribal codes. So one thing that we do talk about is being culturally relevant, depending upon what type of code it is, making sure jurisdiction is clearly spelled out, because we have different criminal jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction where we need to take into account not only federal laws that have impacts, but also U.S. Supreme Court decisions. And knowing, the purpose and accessibility of tribal laws. So one of the things in tribal code drafting and thinking about tribal laws is that tribal people often read tribal laws, I think, a lot more than state citizens read state laws. And I'm not sure how much people read federal laws. But I think tribal people read tribal law. And so having the statutory skills on drafting accessible language and not getting caught up in our heretofores and wherewithals that we have in law school is something that sometimes students have to unlearn.
I love that. Is there a cultural or spiritual value that you wish every law student understood before working with a tribal client?
I think the basic one that we often talk about is respect, is just having that sense of respect, and then that's related to humility, that you may not know everything, and that's okay, and being okay with the unfamiliar and being willing to ask questions. So, one thing I tell my law students is never say sorry if you're going to ask a question. You're a law student, you're supposed to have a curious mind and ask questions. So bringing that into learning about a new tribe. I don't know everything about every tribe. I'm a tribal member of a particular tribe, and I've had experiences with various tribes, but I'm still learning. And so we have to have that kind of humility and respect.
What advice would you give to students who want to work in Native American law?
Take some classes, join organizations, and do it with a good heart.
That's good. And I think we've talked about people becoming, well, I guess we haven't, but how can we become good allies to our tribal nations?
So, good allies, one of the things that is very important to us is that we locate ourselves. So I started with my traditional name, and I'm an enrolled member of a tribe. And we like people to be transparent with us and not make it a mystery if you are an enrolled member of a tribe or if you have kinship for a descendant status, and then tell us about that. Are you a first generation descendant? Do you have a parent that's enrolled? And if you don't, then being very upfront about I'm an ally, and then it's like, yay, okay, now we know. Um, because we try to locate people within our genealogy. And that's just our kinship worldview. And so being a good ally is letting people know I'm an ally. I'm a non-native ally. And then it's like, oh, okay, I know. Um, the good faith that you're bringing into this relationship with us, and we can go from there and keep building. Like I said, we're all treaty people, so that perpetual peace and friendship, you got it. You understood that. Yay! You're living it. So, as a good ally, one of the things to understand is just the imposition of a lot of federal policies on tribal people. And while we want allies to be educated and um, speak up in many different spaces. If there's a Native person there and they are um, wanting to be a voice, allow them to be that voice and support that voice before you center yourself first. So that's something that we appreciate from allies.
Before we wrap up this podcast, for any Native students that might be listening, is there any advice you would like to give them?
You're being cheered on by your ancestors. We're so proud of you. We know it's difficult. You know, the law school curriculum as a whole has a lot of places that can be very emotionally traumatic, but keep going because one day you will be able to advocate for the people that you care about. And so that's what I would say is that you've got to focus on your legal studies and leave the politics of the world alone until after you graduate. And then you can do whatever you want, but get those grades.
That's great. I hope this has been educational for anyone listening. I think this was just really informational. I hope for those that are non-native students, you heard this and are seeking to learn more, and do reach out and educate yourself and be respectful of Native voices this month and in all months, really. Um, But thank you so much for joining us, Professor Eaglewoman. We really appreciate having you. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to the Mitchell Hamlin School of Law Journal of Public Policy and Practice podcast. We hope this episode sparked your curiosity and deepened your understanding of the legal and policy challenges we face. Happy Native Heritage Month.
Adamayaye.